Hello, what's up guys, Medium Guy here, and welcome to the next video on the video series dedicated to Caddy as a Docker container. So in this video we're going to learn how to manage and enable or disable logs. So if you want to learn more, stick with me. So as you can see right over here, I'm in the documentation page related to log directive, and using this directive we can enable and configure HTTP request logging, and by configuring it based on our use cases, we can actually tell Caddy to output the logs to a file or standard output or standard error, or to a socket listener on the network that is accessible by this Caddy server. So if I move down, you can see the syntax that we can actually configure the logging for Caddy server. And if you want to deep dive in this, you can always read through this documentation to configure the logging exactly based on your use cases. So right over here on the output modules, you can see that we can configure Caddy to send the logs to the standard error or standard output, or discard logs for, like, for example, some paths that we actually don't want the logging on those paths, or actually send the logs to some files and later maybe using some other tools like Promptail or Logstash or tools like that to actually grab these logs from these log files and actually send them to some log backend, like for example Loki or Elasticsearch or tools like that, to actually try to visualize and analyze your requests and actually get the required information based on these logs. So the output that I'll try to configure will be the file output, so we can see the syntax and all the configuration that we can actually use to configure the logging based on our use cases. So as it is written right over here, by default the log files are rotated to prevent disk space exhaustion. And also, as we can see right over here, by using these exact configurations, we can actually tell how much of the latest logs to actually keep and for how much time to keep these logs and things like that. So if I move to the VS Code right over here on the related directory to custom logs inside my GitHub repository, where I'll put all my files and configurations and all stuff that I create in my videos, and for which you can find the relevant link down in the description section of this video. So as you can see, I've got a Docker Compose file prepared in order to demonstrate how the logging will actually work and how we can actually configure the Caddy to output these logs and keep them based on our use cases. So as you can see, I've got two services in my Docker Compose file. One is a backend server, which is actually an echo server that will actually respond with the detail of whatever request that it will receive. So it is a good enough tool for us to use to reverse proxy as an upstream server for the Caddy service. So if I move down right over here, you can see that I'm using the official Caddy image with some recent tag, and actually by setting the restart policy, I am telling the Docker engine to actually try to restart this container that will hold my Caddy server by whatever reason that this container will be stopped. So by using this environment section, I'm actually able to pass the environment variables to inside the container that will be created, and by passing the time zone, I'm actually configuring the time zone inside the container that will be created. So right over here on the port section, I'm mapping the 80 and 443 port to exact same ports inside the container. So as a result, these ports will be exposed from the container to the host machine's IP address, and by using that IP address with these exact ports, I'll be able to actually communicate with the container and eventually with the Caddy server that I'll configure it to listen on these exact ports, and I'll be able to send requests and receive responses from this Caddy server. So lastly, on the volume section, you can see that as always I'm passing the ./caddyfile to /etc caddyfile, which is exactly the file that the Caddy server will try to look for the configuration inside this file to initially configure itself when coming up. and over here I'm mapping the ./data and ./config directory next to this exact Docker Compose file to /data and /config inside the container. So you'd actually want to persist these directories because the Caddy server by default will try to store its data and config files that it'll be creating along the process. And lastly, I'm mapping the ./logs directory to /logs inside the container. So basically I'll try to configure the Caddy to store its logs on the /logs directory inside the container, and as a result, because this exact directory is mapped to the outside of the container on the host machine, I'll be able to actually access these log files on the ./logs directory next to the Docker Compose file. So next, if I move to the Caddyfile, you can see that I'm actually creating a snippet to actually configure the logs, and later I'll try to import this snippet, and by passing the relevant arguments, I'll be able to differentiate between different logs that will be eventually stored as log files on the /logs directory. So you can see that by passing the log directive, I'm actually able to configure the logging, and by passing the output and setting it to file, I'm actually telling the Caddy to store its logs on the given path right over here. So the point is that I'm passing the first argument when I'm actually importing this snippet as the name of the file that will be stored on the /logs directory. By passing the role size and setting it to 1 GB, I'm actually telling the Caddy the maximum size of the log files that will be created. Also, by saying the role keep, I'm actually telling Caddy the maximum number of the log files to keep, and by passing the role keep for and setting it to some duration, I'm actually telling the Caddy for how much time to keep these created log files. So if I move down right over here, by passing the format directive, I can actually define the shape of the logs that will be outputted and stored in the log file. So like for example, you can see that by passing the request headers user agent and by saying delete, I'm actually removing the user agent from the log lines that will be stored in the log file. So this is just for demonstration purposes, and is just to show how you can actually customize based on your use cases of the log lines that you want to store in your log files. Also, again, using the same directive and by saying the append, I'm actually able to append some extra information to the log lines that will be stored also in the log files. So like for example, I'm setting the environment as Docker that will be appended to all of the log lines that will be eventually stored in the log files. So lastly, right over here, by passing the level configuration and actually getting its value from the arguments, the second argument to be exact. So by doing this, we'll actually be able to tell different levels of logging when we want to actually import this exact snippet. So we can pass things like error or info to actually differentiate between the log levels that will be sent to these exact log files. So if I move down right over here on the global section, you can see that I'm actually disabling the automatic redirect from HTTP to HTTPS. So as a result, I'll be able to make requests using the HTTP protocol also. And right over here, I'm actually importing the logging snippet that I actually defined right over here. And by passing its two arguments, I'm actually defining the first argument to be appended to the log file name, and the second argument to be used on the level as we defined right over here. So by doing this, I'm actually telling the Caddy to store all the error logs in the /logs/API_error.log file, And if I move down right over here, you can see that I'm importing the same snippet, and by passing access as the file name and info as the log level, I'm actually outputting different levels of logs to different files. So as you can see, I'm configuring the Caddy to listen to exact same ports that I map to the outside of the container in the Docker Compose file. And right over here, by using a simple handle directive and passing the /API path, I'm actually reverse proxying to the backend service that I defined with the exact same name in the Docker Compose file. So apparently, as you might also know, because these two containers will be created using the same Docker Compose file and attaching to the same network, these two containers eventually will be able to call each other through their service names. So with having all this in mind, I'll move to the terminal right over here. I'll hit ls to make sure that I'm in the exact same directory that I've got my Docker Compose file and other configuration files. I'll actually first try to remove all the files that exists in the logs directory. I'll actually try to use sudo to make sure everything will be removed inside the logs directory. So if I say ls logs, I can see that no files actually exist in the logs directory, and by saying docker compose op-d, I can see that both my containers will be created with a network attaching these two containers to that network. So if I say docker compose ps, you can see that both my containers are up and running with the exact same ports that I defined mapped to each container. And by saying docker compose logs -f to follow the logs and --tail 100 to grab the latest 100 lines of the outputted logs of these two containers. So as I can see, things are looking good, and right now we'll be able to make requests and see the outputted logs to the relevant files. So using another terminal, I'll try to make requests using curl to the localhost on port 80 to the /API path, and if I hit enter, actually I should path -i not -it, and I'll hit enter, and you can see that the reverse proxying worked correctly, and as a result, I'll go back right over here, I'll hit Ctrl C, I'll hit ls logs, and you can see that a file has been created. If I say tail -f, the logs API underline access.log, and I'm getting permission error, so I'll say sudo in the beginning, I'll hit enter, and I'll try to make some other requests. You can see that the log lines are being appended with my each request that I make to the Caddy server. Also right over here, you can see that the env, which is set to Docker, is also appended to the log lines as I defined in the Caddyfile. Also, if you inspect the log line, you will not find the data related to the user agent. Also, because we filtered the log lines and removed the user agent from all the log lines that will be appended to these log files. So I'll hit Ctrl C and try to remove the container for the echo server. So as a result, the reverse proxying will not work, and actually I'll expect the Caddy to write to the error log to see if the logging is working as I am expecting. So I'll say docker rm -f, and by passing the echo server's container name, I'll hit enter to remove that exact container. So again, I'll try to make some other requests. So you can see that I'm getting some errors because apparently that container is removed and Caddy cannot actually reverse proxy successfully to that container. So I'll hit ls logs, and you can see that the API underline error file is also created, again by saying sudo tail -f logs API underline error.log. you can see that all the error logs are actually being appended right over here. So I'll try to make some other requests, and you can see that they are actually being appended with each request that will be errored on the Caddy. So that's all for this video. I hope you learned something new in this one. If you have any questions, any recommendations, of course you can go ahead and ask me in the comment section of this video, and I hope you get the whole idea. And right now you should be able to configure the Caddy based on your use cases to actually configure the logging for all your requests that are passing through your Caddy container. Also, if you haven't watched the previous videos, I'll recommend you give a visit where you can learn the basics or cool features like load balancing, custom error pages, and things like that. So actually you can find the link to the playlist down in the description section. And if you found the video interesting, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to my channel, which will help grow the channel and motivate me to create more free contents like this. And with that, that's all for this video, and I hope to see you in the next videos.